The long muscles of his back flinched as she touched him, as if even the lightest touch were torture. She pressed her cheek remorsefully to his blazing skin. Jason turned slowly, as if a sudden move would break the tenuous thread of his self-control. He took her against him. She felt the hard, hungry tension of a leopard ready to spring.
I followed the formula exactly,
she managed to say.
It should be working.
Jason dragged his mouth down to the joint of her neck and shoulder, nuzzling roughly. Paradoxical reaction, he said.
You mean like when an antidepressant causes suicidal thoughts in some people, or...
She started as she felt his hands go to the fastening of her jeans, the top button popping free, the zipper hissing.
Or when pain medication gives someone a headache?
A gasp was torn from her throat as his hands slid into the back of her jeans, beneath her underwear. I want you, he muttered against her skin, and I hope the feeling's mutual.
Yes, but I...
Because there's no chance in hell that you're leaving this room without getting laid. Justine's eyes widened. She couldn't think straight with the way he was rubbing her against him, his mouth and hands navigating her body with urgent demand. She was shocked by the things he was saying between each ragged breath. He wanted to kiss and touch and own every part of her, make her beg, make her come so hard she would think she'd been turned inside out. And I wanted all that, damn you, he muttered, even before you slipped me a roofie.
It wasn't a roofie,
she protested.
I mixed up a discouragement potion to make you not want me.
He crushed his lips to her throat, the kiss strong and gnawing. Does this feel discouraged to you, he demanded, shoving her jeans down her hips, gripping her bottom with both hands. Her eyes half closed and her head tipped back as he brought her against the thick, enticing pressure of his erection.
No,
she managed to say weakly.
If you want, I could go look up an antidote.
I already have one in mind. He tugged her shirt over her head and reached for the back fastenings of her bra. She felt her jeans slip to the floor, and she stepped out of them clumsily. After her underwear was flung aside, Jason shed his own jeans, his gaze locked on her as if half expecting her to bolt and run. They were not going to talk first, turn down the lamp, close the window, lay their discarded clothes on a chair. There was a strong possibility that they weren't even going to make it to the bed. He pulled her against him, front to front, kissing her endlessly, his mouth gentle and savage by turns. The heat of him was unbearable, the skin of his stomach and chest and groin blistering. Justine pulled her lips from his, panting. The air was sauna hot, scorching the inside of her lungs. Jason reached to the table behind her, fumbling with the crushed ice. He cupped some of it against her breasts, drew an icy handful along her torso. Justine shivered and gasped in relief. The water trickled over her skin, raising goose flesh. His mouth caught at a budded nipple, sucked the moisture from it. He reached behind her for more ice, spread it over his own chest and down the front of his body, and cupped some to his mouth. Burning and disoriented, Justine gripped the edge of the table behind her as Jason lowered to his haunches. She bent her head, her hair falling in streamers around her face. She felt his cold hands high on her thighs, thumbs stroking upward to where the skin was thin and excruciatingly sensitive. The blushing folds were parted, held open. She jerked with an incoherent sound as she felt the startling chill of his mouth, his tongue against her tender flesh, stroking cool circles around the swelling peak. She sobbed with every breath, struggling to keep quiet, but it was impossible. She covered her mouth with one hand to smother a low cry and pushed frantically at his dark head. A slow, shameless lick across the delicate full ache, a hoarse murmur, and then he stood. He nudged her toward the bed, but her legs were too stiff to walk. Picking her up with astonishing ease, he carried her to the mattress and lowered her onto her back. Her thighs opened in a wanton sprawl, her arms half curled and defenseless above her head. She was on the edge of climax, red-faced and dazed. Reaching up for him, she drew him fully over her and pulled his head down. He kissed her, sending his tongue deep, and it felt so good that she moaned in his mouth. Widening her thighs with his knees, he entered her in a demanding thrust. Her knees drew up, her body buckling into the delicious masculine weight of him. A sheen of sweat gave his skin a metallic luster, light gilding the paths of veins on his arms and neck. His eyes had closed, his brows drawing together as if he were in pain. He drove inside her with a fast, vehement rhythm, not holding back, and she didn't want him to. She pushed back at him, lifting and lifting, her flesh ratcheting tighter around the thickness of him, until both of them groaned and shuddered in pleasure, shock searing through every nerve. Jason shoved deep and held, and she could feel the heat of his release inside her. The preceding passage is from the book Crystal Cove, written by Lisa Kleypas. The copyright is 2013. I read as a hobby all kinds of books, mostly fiction. And I've read quite a few books like this where a female author will describe these kinds of torrid, passionate affairs between their main characters and their stories. I follow, to some extent, what's going on in the culture war between men and women. I don't have any strong opinions either way. I just find it interesting. But one common theme that I've seen repeated over and over again is about how a woman will allow herself to be taken by a man so long as that man is described as being, very handsome, tall, muscular, and very successful. Now, this is a story aimed at women. It's a woman's romance novel. So I'm certainly not knocking it. And, whereas men might have a fantasy about building a suit made out of iron and flying around fighting crime, women will have fantasies more akin to what we find in Crystal Cove. I just think it's interesting that if the roles were reversed, and if we had a male author describing a scene where he drugged a female companion, and then they ended up having really intense, passionate sex, what kind of outcry we would have seen from mainstream media and the Twitterati. Can you imagine what the response would be if this had been a scene from a movie? And what if the man wasn't described as being very attractive? Then we'd have a Weinstein moment all over again. I think I'm going to read more passages like this from various novels because I do find it very interesting. And I have to say, I like the fact that female authors still write books like this, and I'm going to continue to support them.